Alright, today's lesson is on you can't see it up, but it's up here, it says the outcome of World War I. So how did the war to end all wars end? Now we'll first look at exactly how it actually ended, and then we'll look at the effects that happened after that. So you've got that World War ends on November 11th, 1918, with the signing of a treaty called the Armistice. And if you remember from Veterans Day, this armistice was signed on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, and the day we now celebrate Veterans Day. It was signed because a revolt in Germany caused the emperor to step down. So Germany is no longer a strong power, so they don't have anyone to really represent them or to continue the fighting, because the emperor is down because the people in Germany didn't like the way he was taking the country. You've also got the Austria-Hungary, AH means Austria-Hungary, was close to a collapse. So again, they have fought too hard, their people are tired, their military is expended, they're about to collapse. And so you can see, because those two main powers weren't doing very well, but the Allied powers are the winner. So we look back at the very beginning of the war. We looked at the two alliances. So the Triple Entente: Great Britain, France, and Russia. Russia who leaves, but they are the winners in the end. And the U.S. is also on the Allied side. So when the war ends, there's often, when any conflict ends, you usually sign some type of treaty, some type of agreement to try to keep the war from happening again. And so in this case, the treaty that was signed is called the Treaty of Versailles, named after the place that was signed in Versailles, France, and it was signed in 1919. So kind of shortly after the war was officially over. And in the treaty, there's a bunch of different components of the treaty to figure out how, really about Germany and how they couldn't regain power and hopefully not start another world war. So who was there? Invited to this signing of the Treaty of Versailles and the creation of the Treaty of Versailles was the Big Four. And those Big Four are Great Britain, U.S., France, and Italy. And you'll notice there's some people missing here, right? So none of the defeated nations, like Germany, or what was Austria-Hungary, or Russia even, or Italy, actually not Italy, or Italy was invited because we talked about that, they left the war early. So none of these defeated nations were allowed to attend. So, could maybe cause some problems, but let's look at what the treaty then said, okay? So we know who's there, let's look at what it said. So in there, I had a variety of terms. I'm going to shorten it into kind of 5 different categories. We had reparations, and these reparations are a payment. So it was forced Germany to pay money to the winners. And just a few years ago, so the war, this is in 1919, just a few years ago, Germany finished paying off those reparations, so they were quite large. Had something to do with land. So Germany had taken over the Alsace and Lorraine area and some other areas of France. They had to give it back, right? When you lose something, you usually have to give it back. So they had to give back the land to France. Austria-Hungary just disappeared. The whole empire collapsed, it disappeared, and when that disappeared, a bunch of new countries came around. Because they took the land that was in Austria-Hungary and they divided up amongst these countries that many of them are still around today, not all of them. That was Latvia, Finland, Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, try to say that a bunch of times fast, Austria and Hungary. So Austria and Hungary, right, no longer exists, but Austria and then a separate country named Hungary exists. It also had a tenet that Germany had to reduce its military. So that's the Army and the Navy. And they also had to get rid of their submarines. Remember, they were the ones who did most of the submarine warfare in World War I. And their Air Force. So they have a really small military. And with a really small military, the hope that just addresses the militarism issue, they can't fight if they don't have the military. Germany also had to take responsibility for the war. So they had to take full responsibility. It was all Germany's fault that the war happened. That's what they had to do. And it created this thing called the League of Nations, which was supposed to be an organization that all countries join to help to solve conflicts before they get out of hand. All right, so now we're going to look at 3 types of effects: economic, political, and social. And if you remember from our lessons at the beginning here, economic has to do with the money, the trade, the jobs. That's the type of effects we're going to look at first. So we've got really we're just going to look at kind of the money it costs, but it costs more than any previous war in history. So it is the war won all wars. It's it's the biggest war ever. So of course it's going to cost the most. So you've got 186 billion, not million, billion in direct costs. So that's how much it costs to feed and clothe the troops, to get the new weapons ready, anything that relates to the actual fighting of the war. But what's interesting here is that you have 151 billion, almost as much, 30 billion different, but still a high number, 151 billion in indirect costs. What are those, you might ask? Those are things like the buildings being destroyed. So if someone bombs a city in England, you have to rebuild those things, so that costs to rebuild the infrastructure. So those are things that would go along with indirect costs. You also have after the war, so this is after the war, that Germany's money becomes worthless. They try to print so much money because their economy is tanking, essentially, so they print a lot of money, and when you print a lot of money, this thing called inflation happens, and your money becomes worthless. So you have so much out there that a dollar is not worth a dollar anymore, a dollar is worth more like a penny, and so their money becomes worthless, so they start to go into a bit of a depression. But the U.S. comes in here, right, and they actually grew right after the war. There was a lot of, Europe was destroyed, so they were looking to the U.S. to help out building things and supporting them, giving them money to help them rebuild stuff. So the U.S. grew and became the world's leading creditor. So if someone needed to borrow money, the U.S. had it because the war wasn't on, though we were in the war wasn't on our territory, so we weren't really destroyed, so we could help them out. We had the resources to help out the rest of the world. But that only lasts for a while, because in the 1920s, what happens is the depression and the economic instability and the economy being so bad in Europe, they can't bounce back out of it because their buildings are destroyed, their factories are destroyed, they can't come out of it, and it leads actually to a worldwide depression. So not just in Europe, but the whole world, and the U.S. His hits in the 1920s with the U.S. So other kind of effects that we have are political effects. So this has to do with the government and how governments around the world changed because of the war. So you'll see the most interesting thing, I think, is that the types of governments start to change. So before you have like 4 really large monarchies, 4 of them collapse after the war, like are totally gone, totally new types of government in those areas. So those are Russia in 1917. So Russia actually gets out of the war before it's over because they have a revolution. And in that revolution, they take out the Tsar and they say, we don't want a monarchy anymore. Right? And they actually start communism when their monarchy falls. You've got Austria-Hungary, again, I'm condensing it to AH. Austria-Hungary just completely disappears. It was a monarchy, but it collapses and it becomes a bunch of different countries, so it's not a monarchy anymore. Germany was a monarchy. They called their leader the emperor, but because they lose, right, and there was a revolt right before the end of the war, in 1918, they're no longer a monarchy, and they go through a series of different kinds of government, elected and appointed, until we get to a very famous leader there prior to World War II. And then the Ottoman Empire in 1922. So it's not directly after the war, but because of the ideas of the war, the Ottoman Empire actually becomes Turkey, that's what it's called today, in 1922. And with that, you see a lot more modernization in what is now Turkey. So the big change that you see is, again, the downfall of ideas like monarchy, and the most popular, right, type of government becomes the republic. And if you remember back from our flip lesson from last unit, you remember the republic has to do with electing officials and people have the power, whereas a monarchy, it was that one single person that had the power. So this becomes a lot more popular. Like before the war, you've got 19 monarchies and only 3 republics around the world, around Europe. Afterwards, you still got 13 monarchies, right? But you have 14 republics. That's a pretty large increase within only a matter of years for republics going. Remember, after Austria-Hungary collapses, you actually have a bunch of new countries forming, so that might be part of that number. Politically in Italy, you have this idea of this thing called fascism coming around, and we'll talk about that when we get to the causes of World War II, but it's this idea that the government holds a lot of power, much like a dictator, and you can't complain. If you complain, right, you'll have some type of punishment. And the government also likes to control a lot of the means of production, so the factories, the jobs, they control a lot of those. And again, it's like a dictatorship when you can't complain. And we'll talk about fascism in World War II. The U.S., right, directly after World War I, decides to isolate themselves. And that means that they're not going to interact with the people around the world as much as they may have before. So if I don't talk to anyone, maybe I won't get into a conflict with them, but we'll see that that only lasts for so long. The Middle East and Southeast Asia, where there are a lot of colonies, where European powers went out to colonize other countries, or these countries in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, areas like India, Pakistan, the Middle East, countries today like Saudi Arabia, they see colonial revolts. So the people in the colony are like, now that the war's over, Republic is getting a lot more popularity. They're saying, you can't rule us anymore, imperial powers. We don't want you in our country anymore. Please leave. They're not asking nicely. They're doing it more forcefully, with more violence, but we're starting to see the end of imperialism here. And then in Germany, with the anger, right, of all of the people, they were blamed for the war. They have to pay money for the war. They don't have any military. They're kind of embarrassed, right? They're looking for a strong leader that will take their pride, take their enthusiasm for their country, and will bring Germany back to glory again, right? They're kind of been put in timeout, and they don't want to be in timeout anymore. They want to be where they can have some power. So you're going to start to see slowly, right, the rise of Hitler. He's starting to gain power and eventually becomes the leader of that country. And we'll talk about how that leads to World War II later. And finally, we have the social effects. So what did it do to the actual people of the countries? And we're going to look more at how many died from that. So the death toll, right, is 9 million soldiers and sailors. 9 million people, that's a lot of people. In England, or the British, you see 1 million people. Austria-Hungary, you see 1.5 million soldiers die. In France, 1.7. In Russia, 1.7. In Germany, 2 million. Right? So there are other countries that are involved, so this doesn't include all right here, but overall 9 million soldiers or sailors die. Sailors will be in the Navy, soldiers will be in the Army. So you also have 7 million that are permanently disabled. So maybe lost a leg, lost a limb, lost sight. They can't function as they used to. There's some type of thing that's left them disabled. Things like the gas left a lot of people with lung conditions or blind. You have a lot of soldiers that come back shell-shocked. We call this today PTSD, you may have heard of it, but they can never function really well in society mentally because of the things that they've seen in war. Their brain has trouble functioning back in society and functioning like it used to because of the traumatic things that they've seen. And finally, you not only have soldiers die, but you have even more people that weren't soldiers die. 13 million civilian deaths. So these are people that are not fighting in the war, but they die because of the war. So they die from 3 main reasons. So the first is from disease. So because of the war, we looked at this when we looked at pandemics, but the soldiers bring back this thing called influenza, the flu. And this pandemic spreads across the world because soldiers were all over the world fighting. They bring this disease back to their homelands, and it spreads like wildfire, killing millions of people. You also got famine. So people are in conflict, food can't get to them, so people are dying of starvation. And then you have this thing, you can't really read it down here, but it says the Armenian Genocide. And that happened in the Ottoman Empire, when a group of people that were called the Armenians, they claimed that they were going against their country, maybe having treason because they were siding with the other side. And they picked the Armenian people and killed them. That's called genocide because when you pick a certain type of group of people, which is an ethnic group, which were the Armenians, and you try to eliminate them or kill all of them, we call it a genocide. In history, Turkey doesn't, or Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey, doesn't like to admit this was a genocide, but most historians think it was a genocide. And so again, that killed millions of people in Austria-Hungary, and they were the Armenian people. So those are the effects of and the outcome of World War I.